matter where you are, inflation is rampant. Eggs are now a luxury item. At one point, it was all the rage to blame Putin for inflation. That was Joe Biden's go-to. It didn't really catch on. So now enter Mark Carney. This chap is the only man on the planet to have been governor of 2 G7 central banks. He was governor of the Bank of Canada and then governor of the Bank of England. So he must be super brainy and reliable. He's currently the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action, whatever that means. And he's talked about as a potential replacement for Dame Jacinda Trudeau as Prime Minister of the Dominion of Canada. According to Mark Carney, Brexit is to blame for inflation. Look at that. We laid out in advance of Brexit that this will be a negative supply shock for a period of time, and that the consequence of that will be a weaker pound, higher inflation and weaker growth, he told the Daily Telegraph. There's no joy in saying, well, we told you so, because people are having to live with that reality. He does actually appear to be taking, I would say, I don't like to complain, but I think he actually is taking a little joy in saying, I told you so. This guy is very deliberate about what he says to the press. Last year, our friend Andrew Lawton tried to pin him down on a Canadian issue in Davos, and he wasn't permitted to speak outside a controlled environment.
Hi, Mr. Carney. Andrew Lawton with True North in Canada.
Nice to see you. I never do spontaneous.
I understand. My one question is, could the Canadian oil and gas sector survive the net zero approach that's being promoted here?
As I said, I never do. If you want an interview with me, like everybody else, you make a request and you can have it.
And will you accept that?
Like everybody else, if I can finish it, okay?
Yeah, as you heard, there's nothing spontaneous about Mark Carney, so his blaming of inflation on Brexit would seem, in contrast, rather calculated. Our stats man, Jamie Jenkins, is on the case. Jamie, how does Brexit cause inflation in, say, Germany and the United States?
Well, indeed, Mark. So let's look at the numbers. Many countries across the European Union, Mark, for the last couple of years have seen inflation much, much higher than the UK. There are countries in the European Union that have had inflation below the UK. And what's pretty much driving inflation across most of the nations across the world, Mark, is the energy prices. And it all depends really on your energy mix and how much you're kind of exposed to the kind of the gas prices that have kind of gone up low. So Germany have had mass inflation. Spain actually had big inflation, but that's come down much quicker than the United Kingdom. So and obviously it's a hot, warmer climate down there. So it depends on pretty much where you are. But that clip you just played of Mark Carney there, Mark, pretty much to me, if he says I can't have an interview without kind of doing a proper booking, he sums up what he's talking about here. Absolute nonsense. He doesn't want an interview with somebody outside of his normal protocol, because he probably wants to know, what are you going to ask me about? Let me get my briefing in and let me tell you the party line or whatever line he wants to tell you. He just, this is absolute nonsense. And the thing is with Mark Carney, Mark, he was in charge of the Bank of England, obviously in the United Kingdom. That was a period of time where we still had very, very low interest rates. He probably could have upped them a little bit to try and get them from these historic lows that we had off the back of the financial crisis. But, he's a globalist. He's blamed Brexit in the past for certain things, and he's already had to roll back himself by saying that all the doom and gloom that he thought Brexit would deliver actually hasn't happened. And for him to come on and say that Brexit is the cause of inflation when other countries in the European Union and beyond have had inflation proves that it's a bit of an agenda here, Mark. And remember, what we were talking about probably a couple of months ago, Mark, was we had other people blaming kind of delays at airports on Brexit. Everybody blames Brexit. I can imagine in 2050, Mark, we probably won't be talking in 2050. We'll be long gone with them probably. But in 2050, some people will say, oh, that's probably to do with Brexit.
Yeah. You have a preference among recent former governors of the Bank of England. You disdain Mark Carney, but you think Sir Mervyn King might be on to something.
Well, Mark, yeah, we've touched on this before on the show. So Mark Carney says Brexit is the cause of inflation. But if you just look at economic theory, simple economic theory, this is the kind of the 101 you're taught when you're doing your economics A level. You haven't even got to go to university to do this. That if you print loads and loads of money, if you increase the money supply, that will cause inflation. I think your producers have got what Mervyn King thinks is the cause of inflation at the start of all of this.
And central banks have lost control of inflation. Governments lost control of the public finance. Not surprising that markets respond to that.
And whose responsibility was it then, if both the central bank and the government lost control?
Well, I think all central banks in the West, interestingly, made the same mistake. And during COVID, when the economy was actually contracting because of lockdown, central banks decided it was a good time to print a lot of money. That was a mistake. That led to inflation. We had too much money chasing too few goods, and the result was inflation. That was predictable, it was predicted, and it happened.
And as you said, you don't have to have gone to university to get that, because that's basically the economics you would learn in high school or even younger.
And the critical couple of words that Mervyn King said there, Mark, it was predictable, and it happened. You know, it was predictable, all the stuff that they did. And the other thing he said is that they all made the same mistake. So let's look at this. Let's decipher this. Predictable and all made the same mistake. Same with lockdowns. All countries made the same mistake with lockdowns. And it was probably predictable that the health services across many nations would kind of collapse off the back of that as well. So you put all this and you start questioning, you know, people in, public expect very respected, very intelligent people to be running these institutions. But if you mark the homework of the last 4 or 5 years, where obviously the pandemic itself had this big shock for the system, but you start marking the homework of what we've seen is the banks have really messed up. Who's winning at the moment, Mark? The banks are actually winning because interest rates are going up. The profits of banks are going through the roof. And I think that's probably a topic that we need to look into a little bit more over the coming months. And then during the pandemic, who won? Well, all these people who had these links to these PPI contracts and the government paying absolute fortunes. So the public are losing an absolute fortune through all of this, Mark. Central banks have let us down. And I'm much more in the Mervyn King camp. He's got no skin in the game. Mervyn King is pretty much retired from public life. He pops up now and again to give his view as a former governor of the Bank of England. But what you've talked about, Mark Carney's still looking for that next big post that he wants to have. I'd rather trust Mervyn King's opinion on things, Mark, than Mark Carney. And if Canada are going to end up with Mark Carney, well, God help them.
Well, that's an interesting point in and of itself, isn't it? Sir Mervyn, whether he's retired or not, but he seems, by comparison, a sort of parochial figure. You know, you can introduce him on the BBC as a former governor of the Bank of England, whereas for some reason I don't quite get, Mr. Carney, you called him a globalist, but he seems to bestride the world like a colossus. Here he is in Davos, or here he is at something in Malibu, or here he is at some conference in Tahiti. It's very strange the way a man who was not obviously successful simply rises ever upward.
Well, it's not the saying, jack of, all trades, but a master of none, because it's pretty clear he hasn't got no trade that he's a master of, because if he's doing all of these things, you can't be an expert economics, expert in climate, expert at running countries. Mark Carney seriously needs to, knock it on the head if he still thinks Brexit. I'm a stats guy, Mark. We've talked, for the last year or so on numbers. You introduced a clip here today. You've only got to look at the data. If Brexit was to blame for the inflation in the United Kingdom, maybe you should put a call out for Mark Carney to come on the show. Let's ask him what is to blame for the inflation across the European Union.
Yeah.
Hungary, Turkey, USA. What are going to blame? He won't come on the show, Mark, because you will give him a proper grilling that he can't actually kind of control when he would agree to do a media interview with probably the people who want him on. And you won't give him the grilling.
No, and if he ever does decide he's going to be Prime Minister of Canada, you can bet that the CBC isn't going to give him any kind of a grilling on that. You also sent me a rather good quote from Mrs. Thatcher that you like the sound of.
Let us never forget this fundamental truth. The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. And it's no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you. There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money.
Yeah, she is on cracking form as usual there. In fact, you would think people understand that by now, because we were given all this free money during lockdown. People were being paid to stay at home. Oh, it's fantastic. We're closing all the businesses, but don't worry, you're going to be paid just to sit in your one-room flat all week long. And next thing you know, suddenly the United Kingdom has the highest tax burden since the end of the Second World War. People must be able to make the connection between these two things, don't you think?
The problem, Mark, is people can't make the connection and they're fools. So, that clip there from Margaret Thatcher, we're coming from an age where politicians on left and right, far more intelligence than what we've got today. That golden era, some people will criticize Margaret Thatcher for, closing the mines and devastating some local economies, but she had far more intelligence than the current people we've got in today, Mark. So let's look at what she's talking about, though. She's right to at the point that there is no such thing as kind of, government's money. It's all our taxpayers' money at the end of the day. We had a huge bailout of people when we had the COVID pandemic, the banks as well. We had the bank bailout back in 2008. That's what led to austerity across the United Kingdom and many other nations through that period from 2010 through to 2020. And where we are at the moment then, Mark, is now, remember, I think we talked a bit about Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget and this time about, it might have been back end of September time. I can't remember exactly when they come in now. It's so many things have passed. But the thing there was they got kicked out, Mark, because interest rates in the markets got kind of spooked. And at the moment, what we've got is the actual interest rates are much higher now than under that kind of regime. So Hunt and Sunak have failed us there. But let's look at some really critical numbers. Let's put the numbers on this when we talk about borrowing and who's their money. So in April 2023, a couple of months ago, the government borrowed £25.6 billion in the United Kingdom. Now, that's the second highest of the last 30 years. In the financial year ending 2023, Mark, they borrowed 137 billion. The total debt in the United Kingdom is 2.3 trillion. And the government is paying around 10 billion interest in April, 10 billion in April alone, just on the interest of this debt. So to think that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak have got a control on the finances much, much better than Truss and Kwarteng have is laughable, Mark. And I think we all got to come back to that Thatcher's quote. This is not, government's money, it's public money, and the finances have been absolutely shot.
Yeah, but it comes back to that sort of contrast between Mr. Carney and Sir Mervyn, is that there are some things you do that meet the disapproval of the global consensus, because the global consensus is entirely relaxed about its particular model of fiscal profligacy.
Well, I think the biggest issue is, Mark, we'll have another election in the United Kingdom. We'll have elections in Germany, have elections all over the different world. But with these countries, when you've got a debt of 2.3 trillion pounds, Mark, it's laughable to think that people who vote decide who runs the country. The money markets will decide who runs the country, because when you own 2.3 trillion pounds, when you've got 10 billion interest in a month, a course of a year, that's about 107 billion pounds in the financial year in 2023. When you got those kind of debt that you're kind of hanging over you, it's a bit like having a noose around your neck. So whoever's in charge of the country, if Keir Starmer got voted in and he started coming up with policy that the money men and the money women didn't like, well, there'd be a big spook on the markets. The media would be all over it. So democracy, I think, Mark, has kind of died across many parts of the Western world because of these debts. It's pretty much not the voters deciding on the policies. It's pretty much the money men and the money women on terms of these markets. And that's the biggest travesty. We talk about the democratic deficit. That is the big thing. It's the money that drives what's going on, Mark. And people have got to wake up and look at the actual money themselves.
Oh yeah, it's literally a democratic deficit, Jamie. The old, whatever the old joke was, if you owe the bank £1,000, you have a problem. If you owe the bank £1 million, the bank has a problem. If you owe the bank, whatever you were saying, 2.6 trillion, then your country and indeed the entire civilized world has a problem. If this keeps up, it's not going to end anywhere good. Thank you very much, Jamie Jenkins. It's always good to see you. You can follow him at Twitter @StatsJamie, or check out the website statsjamie.co.uk. Thank you very much, Jamie.